The nurse at the front desk looked at me with genuine sympathy in her eyes and said the words I never thought I'd hear about my own father. "I'm sorry, you're not on the approved visitor list." I stood there in that hallway, still wearing my coat, holding a small bag of his favorite crackers I'd picked up on the way, completely unable to process what she'd just told me. My stepmother had removed me, quietly, without telling anyone in the family, from the list of people allowed to see my own father while he lay in a hospital bed 3 floors above me. My name is Angela, and this is the story of the 6 days I spent fighting to get back into a room I should have never been kept out of in the first place. My mother passed away when I was 19, after a long illness that took nearly 2 years to run its course. My father, David, was devastated in ways I don't think any of us fully understood at the time, the kind of grief that hollows a person out quietly behind a calm exterior. 2 years later, he met Diane at a community event, and within 8 months, they were married. I was 22 by then, finishing college, trying to build my own independent life and genuinely, sincerely happy that my father had found someone who seemed to bring some light back into his days. For the first few years, things were fine, even good in some ways. Diane was pleasant at family gatherings, asked about my job, remembered small details about my life. It wasn't until later, slowly, almost imperceptibly, that I started noticing a pattern I couldn't quite name at first. Conversations between my father and me would somehow always happen with Diane present, never just the two of us. Plans I made directly with my father would mysteriously change at the last minute, rescheduled by Diane because his schedule got complicated. Small comments would surface here and there, things like, "Your father gets so worn out after spending time with you, Angela. He needs his rest," said in a tone that sounded caring, but somehow always left me feeling like a burden rather than a daughter. I told myself, for years, that I was reading too much into ordinary family dynamics. Every blended family has adjustments to make, I reasoned. I didn't want to be the difficult stepdaughter people whisper about at gatherings, so I quietly absorbed each small redirection, each subtly rescheduled visit, without making much of it out loud. Over the years, the distance between my father and me grew in ways that were difficult to point to directly, but impossible to ignore once I actually paid attention. Birthday calls became shorter, always somehow cut off by Diane needing him for something else. Holiday visits became smaller in scope. An hour here, 90 minutes there, always carefully managed, always supervised in some indirect way by Diane's presence in the room. I remember a particular Thanksgiving about 3 years before the hospital incident, sitting at their dining table, watching my father across from me and feeling a strange, hollow sensation that I couldn't quite name at the time. He seemed tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. When I tried to ask him directly how he was really doing, genuinely doing beneath the surface pleasantries, Diane interjected smoothly, redirecting the conversation toward holiday plans, dessert, anything but an honest answer from my father himself. I started noticing, too, that my father rarely called me directly anymore. Most communication came filtered through Diane. "Your father wanted me to tell you," or "He's been wanting to call, but things have been so busy." I began to wonder, in quiet moments, whether my father was actually saying these things, or whether Diane had simply decided on his behalf what our relationship should look like going forward. About 18 months before the hospital incident, my father's health began declining noticeably. He'd always had a mild heart condition, managed carefully for years with medication, but increasingly, I heard secondhand, always through Diane, that things were becoming more complicated. Doctor's appointments increased. Hospital visits became more frequent, though I was rarely told about them until well after they'd already happened. I asked repeatedly to be kept informed directly, to be included in conversations about his care. Diane would always agree warmly in the moment, promising to keep me updated, and then somehow, consistently, I'd find out about significant medical events days or even weeks after they occurred, always through some secondhand source, sometimes through an aunt, occasionally through an old family friend who happened to run into my father at a pharmacy. I confronted Diane gently about this pattern once, during a rare moment alone with her at a family gathering. She seemed genuinely surprised by my concern, insisting she simply didn't want to worry me unnecessarily with every small medical update. I wanted to believe her. I desperately wanted to believe that this was simply overprotectiveness, rather than something more deliberate. 6 days before the moment in that hospital hallway, I received a call, not from Diane, but from my father's longtime neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd known our family for over 20 years. She told me my father had been taken by ambulance the previous evening after collapsing at home, and that she'd only learned about it herself because she'd noticed the ambulance lights from her front window and called the next morning to check on him. I called Diane immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed. She answered, sounding tired but composed, and confirmed that yes, my father had been hospitalized, that he was stable, that there was no need for me to come right away since he was resting comfortably, and visitors might be overwhelming for him right now. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that I was coming regardless, that I needed to see my own father. I drove 3 hours that same afternoon, arriving at the hospital just after 6 p.m, exhausted, frightened, and carrying that small bag of crackers I'd grabbed at a gas station along the way, the kind of small, almost meaningless gesture you make when you don't know what else to bring someone you're terrified of losing. The nurse at the front desk on the cardiac unit was kind, genuinely apologetic, as she explained the situation to me. "I'm sorry, you're not on the approved visitor list," she said, glancing down at a clipboard, then back up at me with an expression that suggested she could tell this news was landing somewhere deeply painful. I asked her, my voice shaking slightly, how that was possible. How I could not be approved to see my own father. She explained gently. That visitor lists in that particular hospital unit were typically managed by whoever was listed as the primary point of contact, which in this case was Diane. According to the hospital's records, Diane had specifically requested that visits be limited to immediate household members only, citing concerns about my father's stress levels and recovery needs. I stood there in that hallway for a long moment, the bag of crackers still in my hand, trying to process the fact that my own father's wife had quietly, deliberately, made a decision to keep me away from him during what could potentially be one of the most serious medical events of his life. I asked to speak with a hospital social worker, my voice steadier now, fueled by something between heartbreak and a growing, quiet determination I hadn't fully felt yet but could sense building underneath the surface. The hospital social worker, a calm, patient woman named Renee, met with me in a small private office about 40 minutes later. I explained the situation as clearly as I could, my voice occasionally breaking despite my efforts to stay composed. Renee listened carefully, taking notes, asking thoughtful follow-up questions about my relationship with my father, about how long this pattern of being excluded from his care had been going on. She explained something to me that I genuinely hadn't known before that moment. While hospitals generally respect a designated point of contact's wishes regarding visitor restrictions, patients themselves, if competent and able to communicate, ultimately have the right to specify who they want involved in their care and visitation, regardless of what a spouse or family member might prefer separately. If your father is conscious and able to communicate, Renee told me gently, we can ask him directly who he wants on his visitor list. That's ultimately his decision to make, not anyone else's. That single piece of information changed everything for me in that moment. I'd spent years quietly accepting Diane's version of what my relationship with my father should look like, genuinely believing on some level that I had no real standing to push back against her decisions. Renee's words reminded me of something I'd somehow forgotten over the years. My father still had a voice in his own life, even if Diane had spent years quietly speaking over it. Renee accompanied me to my father's room about 20 minutes later, after confirming with his medical team that he was conscious, stable, and able to communicate clearly. When I walked into that room and my father saw me, his face changed in a way I hadn't seen in years, a genuine, unguarded relief washing over his tired features. "Angela," he said, his voice weak but clear, "I didn't know if you knew. Nobody told me you'd called or come." That sentence alone told me almost everything I needed to know about the previous 6 days. He hadn't known I'd been trying to reach him. He hadn't known I was sitting in a hospital hallway, turned away by a visitor list he likely never personally approved. When Renee gently asked him in front of me who he wanted included on his official visitor list going forward, he answered immediately, without hesitation. "My daughter, Angela. She should always be allowed to see me." Diane arrived at the hospital about an hour later, and I watched her expression shift from mild surprise to something more guarded when she saw me sitting beside my father's bed. We stepped into the hallway together, away from his room, and I asked her directly, calmly but firmly, why I'd been removed from his visitor list without anyone telling me. She offered the same explanation she'd given over the phone days earlier, something about wanting to protect his stress levels, about managing his recovery carefully. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that I understood she believed she was acting in his best interest, but that decision had never actually been hers alone to make. "He's my father," I said, "and it turns out he wanted me here the entire time. He just didn't know I was trying to be." Diane didn't have much of a response to that. She didn't apologize directly, not in any way that felt genuine, but she also didn't argue further. Something in her expression suggested she understood, perhaps for the first time, that I wasn't going to quietly accept being managed out of my own father's life any longer. Over the following weeks, as my father slowly recovered, I made a deliberate effort to be present in ways I hadn't allowed myself to be in recent years. I visited regularly, communicated directly with his medical team myself, and quietly began asking more pointed questions about his overall care, his medications, his upcoming appointments. My father and I had several long, honest conversations during that recovery period, the kind we hadn't had in years. He admitted, somewhat painfully, that he'd noticed the growing distance between us over time, but had told himself it was simply the natural result of me building my own independent adult life, rather than recognizing it as something being actively managed by someone else. I should have asked more questions, he told me one afternoon, sitting up in his hospital bed. I let things happen instead of paying attention to what was actually happening. Once my father was discharged and settled back at home, we worked together, deliberately and openly, to establish clearer boundaries around communication and visitation going forward. He updated his official medical paperwork himself this time, ensuring I was listed directly as an approved contact and visitor for any future medical situations, regardless of who else might be present or involved in his care. I also encouraged him, gently, to have more direct conversations with Diane about how decisions affecting our relationship were being made. I wasn't interested in creating ongoing conflict within the family, but I was no longer willing to quietly accept being filtered out of my own father's life through decisions made on my behalf, without my knowledge or his. I think often about that nurse's face in the hallway, the genuine sympathy in her expression as she told me I wasn't approved to see my own father. I think about how easily that single moment could have gone differently. How many people in similar situations simply accept being turned away, assuming there's nothing more to be done. That family decisions made by someone else must somehow be final. What I learned through those 6 difficult days is that love, real love, sometimes requires asking uncomfortable questions and refusing to quietly accept being managed out of someone's life, even when it feels easier, in the moment, to avoid conflict. My father wanted me there the entire time. He just needed someone to ask him directly, instead of simply assuming on his behalf what he wanted or needed. I still keep that small, half-eaten bag of crackers in my kitchen cabinet, the same ones I brought that first day in the hallway. I think I keep them as a quiet reminder of how close I came to simply walking away, accepting what I was told, instead of staying, asking questions, and finding my way back into a room I never should have been kept out of in the first place.